Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about how to get a house with a very small deposit. Now, there are basically two ways to do this, and I'm going to talk about one of them, which is basically how I got my flat at the age of 26 in London, which was pretty cool, but there are things I wish I'd done differently, and sometimes I regret buying my flat. I really wanted to talk to you about everything about shared ownership. Now, this will be a very long video, so what I've done is I'm going to quickly tell you the sections of the video that we're going to have, and then I'm going to put timestamps at the bottom. If you want to skip sections and things like that, that is totally fine. But obviously if you're completely new to this, then I do recommend watching the whole thing. So this is how I'm going to structure the video. We're going to talk about what is shared ownership, if you don't already know how it works, what it's about and things like that. Then we're going to talk about the eligibility, so not everyone can actually qualify for shared ownership schemes. Then we're going to go into my favourite, which is going to be the pros and cons of shared ownership. For me, like I said, I have my regrets sometimes, but sometimes I'm like, this was a great idea, so I'm going to sort of break that down a little bit in the pros and cons. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the fees and costs that are involved, and then finally I'm going to talk about things to watch out for that I wish I'd known to think about, look out for a little bit more, and really take into consideration before buying my flat. So I'm going to make a coffee because this is a long subject to talk about, and then we're going to dive straight in.
You can't turn the tide, the water go where it wants to go.
Okay, so first things first, let's get into what shared ownership actually is. If you don't know, shared ownership is a part buy, part rent situation. Now, this slightly differs from the Help to Buy scheme in the sense that the Help to Buy scheme, you get a loan from the government for a certain percentage. I think it's up to 40%. I'm not 100% sure, so I'm not going to go into too much into Help to Buy, but it's a 0% interest loan for the first 5 years, and then you get a mortgage on the rest, and then you have to start paying the government back a percentage. Not a percentage, like the interest is no longer free after the 5 years, so your payments will significantly go up. However, with the Help to Buy, you are buying 100% of the property. I have ghosts in my flat, let's not get into it. So with the shared ownership, it differs in the way that what it is you are buying a share of the property. So you will buy between 25 and 75% of the property, and then pay a subsidized rent on the remainder of the property. So if you buy, for example, like I did, 40% of the property, you will then pay rent on 60% of the property. However, the rent will be below the market value. So if we look at an example of some numbers, if you are buying a property that is worth £400,000 and you want to buy 25%, that is you buying £100,000 worth of that property. That means that you will own £100,000 and then pay rent on 3/4 of that property. Now, if you are buying £100,000, the chances are you will need a deposit. With shared ownership, the deposits tend to start at 5% rather than like the normal 10 to 15%. So if you are looking at 5% of a £100,000 share, you are looking at only a £5,000 deposit. Now, that is far more, you know, reasonable to save up £5,000 than to save up 10% of that 400,000, which is £40,000. So for anyone that can't afford to save up for the deposit or can't quite get the mortgage of £400,000 because of their income, this is a great way to get on the property ladder. So a really popular question that I get from people that know that I've purchased a shared ownership property is, can you buy more? And the answer is yes. Absolutely, I can buy more shares, like up to 100%. This is called staircasing. I can now buy increments of the property up to however much I want. If I want to own 100%, I can buy up to 100%, and if I don't, then I can keep it at 40%. So let's look at eligibility. Now, not everyone can get a shared ownership property. So the main rules are: your income, if you are in London, cannot exceed £90,000, and your income, if you are outside of London, cannot exceed £80,000. That includes combined income. So if you're buying as a couple, your combined income cannot exceed that amount. You cannot own any other homes. So this is predominantly marketed at first-time buyers, of course, but if you do own another property, you have to sell that property before you do shared ownership. You do also have to be over 18 in order to qualify for the scheme, and you have to show that you cannot afford to buy a property outright. So if you go and fill in an application and they can see that with the money you earn and the deposit you have, you would be able to afford to buy the property outright, you would not be approved. So now for my favourite, the pros and cons of a shared ownership property. So let's start with the pros. The first one is going to be, it is a great way to get on the property ladder. Yes, it's not ideal, and yes, there are loads of cons to it, but if you cannot afford to buy a property outright and you can afford to do shared ownership, it can be a great way to make some extra money. Now, the reason I said to make some extra money is because pro number 2 is that this actually often works out cheaper than renting in the same area. Now, for me, when I've looked at properties that are of a similar size and in similar neighbourhoods, or in my neighbourhood, generally the property to rent ends up being either around the same price that I pay now for my mortgage, my rent, my service charge and all my bills, or more. So considering that within the amount I'm paying in total, like a chunk of that is going towards my own equity, makes it way more worthwhile, because I'm not just throwing all my money away renting. Of course, it's not as cheap as if I were to just go and rent a room somewhere. A lot of people do this, especially in London. They will just go and rent a room with some flatmates, and that will end up being cheaper than buying a property on shared ownership, which will mean you have more spare income. To be honest, I've got the whole flat to myself and I don't have to live with other people and share my space, and I can just do what I want. The third thing is you will make a share of the profit if and when you decide to sell. So for me, because I own 40%, if my flat goes up in value by £100,000 by the time I sell, and if I still own 40% at that time, I will make a £40,000 profit. Now, this is great because it allows you to make the most out of like the income and the gains that you can make in the property market when you can't properly afford to get on the ladder. The fourth pro is, when compared to renting, you are less likely to get kicked out. So of course there are still ways that you can get kicked out, and we'll talk about them in the cons. However, you will not have a landlord that just decides to change their mind and say, we don't want to rent this to you anymore, or we don't want to rent at all anymore, we want to sell the place and you have to move out. So it really gives you that security in your property if that's what you're looking for. The fifth pro is that you do actually have the option of not paying stamp duty when you buy your property. If you know anything about mortgages or buying houses, stamp duty is a pain. It is so expensive. It seems like a small amount because it's only like a few percent, but actually when you're talking about a property where the value is like massive, it actually ends up being a lot of money. So with shared ownership, you do have the option of not paying stamp duty until you own over 80% of your property, or you can pay it all in one go at the beginning, or you can pay it in stages, or you can pay it all in one go at the beginning if you like. Now, the choice between those two things is completely up to you. The one thing to bear in mind is that the stamp duty you will pay once you own 80% or more will be valued at the new value of the property, if that makes sense. So if your property goes up in value by £100,000, you will pay stamp duty on the new value rather than what you initially purchased. So if you can afford to pay the stamp duty at the beginning and you are planning to own the property outright, I would say it is probably best to pay it up front. For me, I'm not planning to own 100% of my property, so I opted out of paying the stamp duty. And finally, the most important one, of course, is that you can buy with a much smaller deposit than you would if you were buying a property outright. Now let's look at the cons. So for me, the main downside of this is that your mortgage options are a lot smaller. So not all lenders actually offer mortgages for shared ownership properties, which means that the lenders don't have to compete with each other as much as they do with the normal mortgages, which means the rates that you're likely to get are a little bit less favourable than rates that you would get otherwise. Now, slightly linked to that as well, point number 2 is that quite often 5% might not be enough to either get the mortgage or to get you a good deal. So for me personally, in my experience, 5% wasn't enough. I was actually asked to put down 15%. So I went from what I thought was going to be a deposit of £7,000 to a deposit of £20,000, and that was a massive difference for me, and it wasn't something I planned for, and it ruined a lot of plans in my life. but I still decided to go for it. But it did mean that I got a much better deal in the mortgage, and that is worth sort of considering when you are planning to buy it. So the downside number 3 is there is likely to be a much smaller pool of buyers when you do decide to sell if you don't own 100% of the property. This is what I'm doing. For me, I've bought my 40% and I'm very likely to stay at the 40% unless house prices massively crash. But most people start off by buying a 25% share, and I bought 40%, so it will probably be harder for me to find someone who is willing to buy that or more. So you just have to consider that. That's kind of the reason why I'm not going to staircase further, because unless I decide that I want to go up to 100%, staircasing to say 75% isn't really going to be great, because it's just going to be a lot harder to find someone who wants to do shared ownership starting straight from that amount. The next one is that you cannot sublet. Now, this is a big one, because for me, if I wanted to go with my job abroad somewhere, or wanted to, I don't know, move in with a friend for a while and have someone else pay my mortgage, it is strictly forbidden in shared ownership properties. Even if you own 100%, the likelihood is that you will not be allowed to sublet your property. I think with the 100%, it depends on your housing association, so with that I would check it. But generally, unless you own 100%, it is pretty much guaranteed that you will not be allowed to sublet in any way, whether that be things like Airbnb or generally just like renting your property out to someone else or anything like that. And the final downside for me is the fact that if you do decide to staircase up, the property gets revalued. A lot of people don't realise this and think that they can just buy more shares at the price they originally bought the property at. This is like the whole catch of shared ownership, is that the next time you decide to buy a share, the property gets revalued, and unless the property prices are dropping, which who knows, they might now with everything that's going on in the world, but unless property prices have gone down, you will be paying more for those shares. However, the way I look at things is that if I was going to wait and buy 100% of a property, that time between when I can get in with shared ownership versus when I was going to buy 100%, property prices generally are likely to rise in that time. So I would be paying 100% of the higher price versus like 10-20% or whatever I was staircasing up. Okay, so now let's quickly talk about the fees involved in buying a shared ownership property. A lot of them are fairly similar to just getting a mortgage generally, but unless you've looked into it and researched it, you probably won't know. So I'm just going to quickly run through the main sort of fees that you will get. A lot of them might be similar to just like when you normally buy a house, but unless you've gone through the process or thoroughly researched it, you might not be aware of the different fees that you will incur when buying a shared ownership property. So the way I'm going to do this is just quickly talk you through the fees that I incurred and how much they were, to give you an idea of how much things can cost. Of course, it will vary, you know, the mortgage broker you get might be cheaper or more expensive, but it's just to give you the idea of like whether it's in hundreds or thousands of pounds for each of these and how much generally to try and budget. So the first fee for me was a mortgage broker. That is basically someone who you pay to find mortgage deals for you and tell you how much you're going to pay and all sorts of things like that. They basically approach different banks for you and all that kind of stuff. Now for me, my mortgage broker cost me £300. Secondly, you will have to get solicitors just like you would with a normal mortgage. Now each solicitor will have different kinds of fees, so do your research. I would advise not just going for the cheapest one, because there are things that the lawyers need to pick up on. For example, with me, there was an issue which actually meant there were delays with buying the properties for a lot of people in the block, and if it hadn't been for our lawyers, we would have been kind of screwed in our leases, and it's not something that I would have personally picked up, and I know for a fact that other people in the block who use different lawyers, it wasn't picked up for them. And thankfully, because our lawyers picked it up, it got changed for everyone across the board. However, if you're not lucky enough to have other people around you who are sort of, well, who have better lawyers, or you're buying a house rather than a flat with other people, then you might just find yourself in leases that are rather unfavourable. So for me, my solicitor's fees were about £4,000. once you decide on a mortgage that you want to apply for, you actually have to pay an application fee. I did not know this at all, but in order to apply for a mortgage, you have to pay the bank an application fee. For me, this was actually £200. Now, in comparison to generally how much money you're spending buying a property, £200 might not seem like a lot, but that's £200 that I didn't budget for, that suddenly I was like, oh, by the way, can you transfer me the £200 for the mortgage application? It's just crazy. It's like all these fees that you don't think of that just can constantly add up. Now, we talked a bit before about stamp duty. Stamp duty is one of the fees that you may or may not have to pay. For me, this was not a cost that I incurred. However, if you do decide that you want to pay the full stamp duty at the beginning because you don't want to pay more of it when the property gets revalued up later on, then I would budget a good few £1,000s for that as well. The way that stamp duty payments work is you can either pay in full now or you can pay in stages, which generally means you don't pay anything now because of how shared ownership works. Stamp duty is actually 0% on anything up to £125,000 at the time of filming this video. So quite often your initial share won't exceed that £125,000. So finally, I want to talk to you about things to watch out for and sort of things I wish I'd known before I got my property so that I'd known to watch out for these. So the first big one for me is the ground rent. Now, this only applies if you're buying a flat. So with like pretty much all of the shared ownership properties, unless you're really lucky and find one that isn't, they are all leasehold. That means you pay a ground rent to the landlord, to the owner of the land. And these can be really tricky, and this is one of the issues that we had sort of with the leaseholders and the lawyers and things like that. Within your lease somewhere, you will have something about ground rent. Now, make sure that in your lease it specifies how much the ground rent is allowed to go up by and how often, because for us at the beginning the ground rent was actually unlimited. So right now the ground rent was very small, but in the lease there was no cap on how much it can go up by, and it was reviewed every 5 years. Now, this is way too often. Generally, ground rent should only be reviewed about every 10 years, and it should definitely be capped, because otherwise, first of all, if you're still there, in 5 or 10 years time, your ground rent can technically go up from like a few £100s to a few £1,000s a year, and there's nothing you can do about it. Secondly, if you want to sell and the people that you're selling to and the lawyers are better than you were in the beginning, no one will buy that flat, because they will know that they might be locked into paying so much ground rent. So for me, this isn't something that I need to watch out for. However, thankfully, it was something that was picked up by my lawyers, even though it wasn't picked up by like other lawyer companies. The second thing to look out for is how much is your rent and service charge and what the rules are around increasing that. For me, the rent is increased every year with the RPI, which isn't too bad, but it's just something worth noting. Thirdly, check that you can actually staircase if you want to. So this is something to check both with your housing association, your lease, and your mortgage agreement, because your mortgage agreement might not say you can't staircase up, but you might be locked into a fixed mortgage with penalties if you pay it off any sooner. So that's the case for me. My ability to get a mortgage was somewhat narrowed by the fact that my credit rating wasn't like great, and I did have quite a lot of debt when I was applying for the mortgage, so I didn't have much choice between mortgage lenders. So when it comes to remortgaging, I will hopefully get a better rate, but I am actually locked into my mortgage without the ability to make early repayments or anything like that without gaining penalties, essentially. So if I wanted to staircase now, I would get penalties for remortgaging, for repaying my mortgage early. So I'm completely fine with that, but this is something to watch out for, you know, if you think that you might be staircasing up in a short space of time, or generally just staircasing up at some point. Now, this one for me is really, really important, and it's something that I kind of was aware of at the beginning, but I didn't fully understand what it meant, and now I'm really annoyed by it, and I wish I'd known more and really understood it. Check whether you are locked in to certain utility companies. For me, I am locked into a certain provider. Of course, with water, like, you can't change your water provider. That's fine. That just depends on where you live. But I am locked into my heat provider and my electricity provider. Oh, it's so frustrating. It's like, this is a hard subject to talk about. I didn't really, like, when I signed all my contracts, I signed a thing that basically said you agree to like have this company as your services provider, blah blah blah. I was like, yeah, that's fine. But I didn't know that I won't be ever able to change, and my bills are a lot higher than they would be if I had the ability to change to a different provider. I think this is actually quite common with blocks of flats, so definitely check and make sure you're happy with it, because you will not be able to get out of those utilities companies. You just won't. So I just have to pay higher bills. I think this is something actually that the Competition and Markets Authority is aware of. Whether or not they'll be able to do something about it anytime soon, I don't know. But yeah, it's just a bit frustrating. Finally, check that you're happy with the rules of the housing association. So, you know, each housing association will have different rules that will apply to you, whether you're in a flat or a home. Some of the rules will apply only until you own 100%. Some will apply even when you own 100%. So I would really scrutinize them and make sure you're 100% happy. So for me, it was like the no subletting and no putting clothes out on the balcony and no pets and things. The things that I, in the heat of the moment and the excitement of buying my first property, was like, yeah, that's fine, it doesn't matter. But now I'm really suffering because I'm like, I really want a pet. Or, you know, I'd like to be able to put my clothes out on the balcony to dry. So it's just little things like that, you know, make sure you're happy with them, because with a lot of the things, for example, the subletting, for us, if we sublet and the housing association finds out, you can be kicked out. And when I say kicked out, I mean you will lose your property. Like, your deposit, everything will just disappear. Bye. All that stuff, all the money you've paid in just will be gone. I do generally think it is a great scheme for people who want to get on the ladder. It gets a lot of like negative opinions and negative press, but at the end of the day, for me personally, the majority of the negatives that I've found have been the sort of negatives that I would have whether I bought 100% or 40%. So although there are the negatives that are very specific to shared ownership that I've just mentioned in the cons, I am just trying to think of the fact that actually I'm paying off my equity, and at least I'm making some of that money that I'm paying towards living here back, because it's going into my mortgage, which means when I sell I'm going to get that money back. It's not just sort of seeping into a black hole. But technically, if I was renting a room, it would cost me the same amount that I'm paying in rent and bills here, that is also going into a black hole. However, with this, fingers crossed, I will make a profit when the value of the property goes up and I sell. So that's the one thing that you wouldn't get with renting. And I just really hope that the housing market doesn't crash when I'm gonna want to sell. But anyway, that is besides the point of this video. So I hope that's helpful, and if you've got any other questions about shared ownership that I haven't covered here, I've tried to cover everything that I thought would be useful, but I might have missed something, so just let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I generally make videos about getting out of debt and financial independence and like just generally bossing life. So if that's something you're interested in, do subscribe, and see you next time. Bye.